I'm Pam Fenoff, and I'm honored to be serving as Capital Quilters' current president. Thank you so much for joining us today as we kick off a year of celebration commemorating our 40th anniversary. We work in conjunction today with the State Historical Society of North Dakota, and we're happy to present to you, If Quilts Could Talk, a bed turning. Bed turning is a quilt show presented in a quilt from a quilt's favorite place, the top of a bed. Today's quilts were all provided by members of Capital Quilters, both past and present. We asked each member to select a quilt that is special and provide a story about that quilt. So for the next hour, you will see some beautiful, well-loved quilts and hear their funny, functional, and touching stories. One of our founding members, Ethel Tishmack, who's here today, Ethel was asked how Capital Quilters got its start. She said, "Florence and I have been quilting for years, since the early 70s. In 1981, I read an article in the Bismarck Tribune about an organizational meeting to be put on by the Quilters Guild of North Dakota. Two gals were coming all the way from Fargo to determine if there was an interest in Bismarck to establish a quilt guild and to assist in making that happen. Ethel and Florence drove from their farms, south of Flasher, over 47 miles to a meeting at the Royal Fork Buffet just north of the Capitol building. They sure were interested. The Royal Fork Buffet is long gone, but Capital Quilters is still going strong. We were formally organized that September with Bertha Myers as our first president. We have had 27 presidents over the years, some of them serving multiple terms, and we have all been blessed by many wonderful friendships that have been developed during those 40 years. Ethel remembers that the Guild met at the Marillac Manor in the early years, and when the manor changed hands, the meetings were moved to an activity room at Edgewood Village. We met there until last spring, and due to COVID restrictions, we relocated to New Song Church, who has welcomed us into their gathering place as of September 2020. We're very grateful to them and proud of only 3 moves in 40 years. Capital Quilters is a nonprofit, and we have served the Bismarck-Mandan community in many ways. We have made and donated quilts, receiving blankets and pillowcases to nursing homes, hospitals, shelters, charity raffles, and veterans' homes. We have exhibited our works in banks, libraries, museums, malls, art galleries, quilt shops, and Buckstop Junction's Apple Fest. If I tried to list all of the accomplishment from the Guild over the last 40 years, it would take a lot of time. You'd all be sleeping. We only have 2 beds. So this afternoon, you will discover that we are passionate about quilting and pride ourselves on being a diverse group promoting social and educational pursuits relating to patchwork, applique, and quilted arts, as well as hand, machine, and long arm quilting. Side note here, long arm quilting does not refer to the stretching of our arms as we maneuver to quilt our creations. A long arm is a freestanding frame that acts like a scroll. It holds the quilts flat and taut and in place as a quilting machine on a rolling platform moves from side to side, stitching the 3 layers together. We enjoy a variety of techniques and skill levels, and members are always happy to help each other learn new things. We meet monthly with the exception of July on the first Saturday. Following the business meeting, we show and share our latest projects and conclude with a workshop, open sewing, or coming together on occasion to work on charity projects. We host special events each year, such as this weekend, honoring National Quilting Day, which occurs every March. We have out in the hall to the left, you'll see our quilt show. That's up for 3 days. We had yesterday open sewing and classes. And then today, this year specifically, we have Sensational Sunday. In odd years in the fall, we host a members-only 3-day quilt retreat called Sewcation. It's kind of a staycation thing. We go to a local hotel and we just kind of fellowship and have fun, play games, and of course work on our quilting projects. In the fall of even years, we host a 3-day convention called Quilt Fest, which is open to the public and encompasses a quilt show, a vendor show, and a multitude of classes by local, regional, and national teachers. We canceled Quilt Fest 2020 for obvious reasons, but are about to begin preparations for Quilt Fest 2022, which will be November 4th, 5th, and 6th next year. We invite you all to attend one of our monthly meetings. Our next one will be April 3rd, again at 9:30 a.m. at New Song Church, and April is typically our Charity Day workshop, where we work together. This year we'll be making pillowcases for local shelters and neck warmers for the Bismarck Cancer Center. We thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you enjoy If Quilts Could Talk. Ladies, let's turn those quilts.
Our first quilt is Berts President's Quilt by Bert Myers. It was shared by Jean Wolfe. I treasure this quilt because my friend and mentor, Bertha Bert Myers, made it. Bert was an expert in hand quilting. She was also an encouraging mentor to anyone who appreciated the art of quilting. She shared her passion as a charter member of Capital Quilters Guild 40 years ago and served as its first president from 1982 to 1985 and again in 1989. This quilt was created out of 25 blocks made and signed by Guild members as thanks for her service to the Guild. Bert won several awards. Her trip around the world quilt won second prize in the first quilt show in Fargo, North Dakota in 1979. And in 1984, a quilt she made for the Arthritis Foundation raffle brought $2,500. Bert is remembered for her friendship, her prolific quilting, her willingness to share her skills with others, and her loyal support of the art of quilting.
Ethels Flower Garden by Ethel Tishmack. I saw this picture of a quilt in a magazine. I loved it and decided to draft the pattern. I worked on this quilt for 2.5 years while my husband Pete was in the care center. The flowers are made with yo-yos, which is a circle of fabric stitched around the edge and then gathered in the center to make a puffy circle. I did the applique work while sitting with him and stitched the blocks at home. I finished the quilt in 2012. I have sewn quilts for my daughters and myself. There are always leftover pieces of scrap, and I use these scraps to make more quilts, including this one.
Autumn Fantasy by Florence Harsh. This quilt is special to me because it helped me meet one of my personal goals for quilting. This quilt is of my own design, and it was published on the cover of Quilter's World in October of 2015. I have done a lot of creative quilting, and 9 of my own patterns have been published. But this was the only one to make the front cover. It was one of my personal goals, and I was pleased to meet it in 2015.
Dresden Plate by Agnes Will. This beautiful queen-size Dresden Plate quilt was made by charter member Agnes Will in 1995. Agnes was the president of Capital Quilters in 1985. She made this quilt at the request of her oldest daughter, Eileen, who was moving to a new home. Eileen purchased the blue and coral fabrics and chose the pattern. Agnes machine sewed the wedges of the Dresden Plate together and then hand appliqued them onto white background fabric. She hand quilted each plate and quilted a heart at the center at Eileen's request. Agnes chose a geometric design for the background, quilting between the plates. She finished the edges with a scalloped border to match. This quilt adorns the guest bedroom in her daughter's home. The next 7 quilts are vintage quilts.
Fan Wedding Quilt by Gertrude Melstead. This beautiful fan pattern quilt was presented to us at our wedding in 1976, 45 years ago. My grandparents were hit hard when the banks failed in 1929. Raising 4 kids, they survived by wasting nothing. So Grandma Gertrude's fabric stash was created out of old, gently used clothing from her kids and grandkids. All was done with hand piecing and quilting. Hand piecing is holding two sections together in your hand and sewing a 1/4 inch from the edges with a small needle and thread. We used this quilt on our bed for many years. One daughter investigated it with a pair of scissors, creating memories and necessitating repairs. It is one of my most treasured possessions, but because it was made from used clothing, over the decades it has become too fragile to handle daily use on our bed. It is now stored flat on a guest bed.
Traditional Hexy Star by Izetta Uris. This quilt is special because it was made by my great-grandmother Izetta Uris in the 1960s for my parents, J. Dean and Joan. She made it for them to use on an antique iron bed that belonged to my great-grandparents. My grandmother worked in the dress department at the Yonkers department store in Des Moines, Iowa. There she had access to salesman samples that were used so a lady could order a dress in the style and fabric that she liked. She used this source of fabric to make quilts. If you have a chance to look closely at this quilt, you can see the same design in more than one color in this beautifully made quilt. Note how the binding of this vintage quilt enhances the pattern. Binding is a quilt, where a quilt is finished by binding, which involves sewing a long, narrow strip of fabric around the edge of the quilt.
Mom's Roses by Jean Marr Wolfe. This quilt was given to my mother Dorothy at her 80th birthday celebration, honoring her support of family and decades of piano lessons, playing organ for worship, local newspaper work, community service in Candu, and work as a clerk at husband John's auctioneering business. She could remember names of all attendees, and used this skill for critical record keeping. All knew Dorothy loved flowers and the color pink, thus the beautiful pink roses. This precious gift was made by Jean Marr Wolfe, with over 25 family members contributing to the cost of materials. This quilt was created with 2,700 squares and rectangles sewn together to create the overall design. Each of the 12 rose blocks was made with over 170 pieces of fabric. Jean had the 120 hours she needed to finish this quilt with the help of her family. Her daughter by pressing and unsewing errors. Her husband did household chores. It was a labor of love which still holds warmth and treasured memories.
Cozy Rosy Kisses by Vicky Vasco. This quilt is my first, made for my husband Dwayne in 2003 as a thank you for buying me a new sewing machine. And not just any machine, but one that amazed and almost overwhelmed me with computer functions. Because my Singer, for decades, with its basic forward and back and zigzag, had faithfully sewn my clothes and my children's clothes, darned jeans, and even made a prom dress, it was hard to accept a new sewing machine that needed digital computer codes to operate. I needed the optional lessons, practice sessions, and 3 trials before I accepted the new machine. But it offered new creative freedom to make quilts, which I hope will be beloved family heirlooms. So I took a beginner quilting class, making the lap quilt I am sharing here. I found the crimson fabrics with rose motif perfect for the man in my life. He now uses my blanket of love for naps and as an extra layer at night as we both continue his journey with Parkinson's.
Alice's Quilt by Ethel Tishmak. I made this quilt from feed sacks my husband purchased at an auction. Years earlier, when we raised chickens on our farm, I sewed dresses for my young daughters from feed sacks. A larger feed sack had about a yard of fabric, and if I could, I liked to get more than one, so I could have enough of the same fabric to make a dress. So making a quilt from feed sack fabric brought back warm family memories for me. I made this quilt based upon a class Alice Schott taught at a Capital Quilters meeting. Over the years, I have taught classes myself in Hazen, Flasher, and Mott. I remember buying my first rotary cutter. And a rotary cutter is a circular blade that rotates on a post. It has about a 6-inch handle and protective safety guard. It is used to make straight cuts using a long ruler and a cutting mat. It can also cut multiple layers of fabric
Berts Quilt by Edie Shear and Bert Meyer. When I joined Capital Quilters over 20 years ago, I met Bert Meyer. Living at Marillac Manor, she no longer could quilt, but enjoyed visiting with her quilting friends. We discovered we had the same birthday, and I was her letter carrier. With with our love of quilting made us fast friends. Bert shared a guild story about touring a South Dakota bedspread factory and buying fabric, of course. When she passed away, her children opened the estate sale first to her quilting friends. Luckily, I got one of Bert's quilt tops. I quilted it in honor of my friend, and that is sewing the backing, the batting, and the top together, often with decorative stitches. I enjoyed how Bert fixed quilt making problems such as substituting another color when fabric ran out with what she had on hand, even if it stuck out like a sore thumb. She would say, "Would a guy riding by on a horse even notice?"
Grandma's Hankies by Pat Rotenberger. We had a family weekend at my Aunt Carol's house. Her daughter Kathy taught us how to make a handkerchief quilt. I used my grandmother and aunt's handkerchiefs. I loved the most colorful ones. The border fabric I used to finish this quilt is called Hankies, and it was in my stash. And stash is a term quilters use for a collection of leftover fabric that will hopefully be used for future quilts. I used every inch of the hanky fabric for this quilt. To finish this quilt with the help of my small needlers group, I made a scalloped border. When I took it to Bertha, able to have it machine quilted, I asked her to highlight the hankies, which she did beautifully. I am very pleased with the quilting. This is one of my favorite quilts, and I show it to everyone who comes to my house, unless they've seen it before.
The next four are President's Quilts. This is Friends Are Forever by Teresa Volk and Guild, and I believe Teresa's with us today. She's a past president. There she is. These blocks were made by Capital Quilt Guild members and given to me as a gift for serving as president from 1994 to 1997. One of our challenges while I was serving as president was a shortage of funds. To help raise money needed for basic expenses, I suggested we have a white elephant sale. This raised enough money to cover the cost of our monthly newsletter. We also decided to stop paying members for teaching quilting at our monthly meetings. Members Betty Griffin and Nola Nelson volunteered to teach most of the classes at their own expense. Usually, the retiring president is given her gift of quilt blocks in May at the end of her term. But I received mine at the Christmas party. They were all gift wrap and presented as a total surprise to me. These blocks made a beautiful, meaningful quilt. A block is a section of the quilt created by piecing fabric in patterns, which are then sewed together to make the entire quilt top.
2001 President's Block by Deborah Forsberg. This is a miniature quilt called Mini Memory Chain. Members chose a favorite fabric to construct their link in the chain and sign their name. It has been 20 years. I was president of the Guild from 1999 to 2001. Those were exciting days as we wondered if our computers would all crash rolling into 2000. We also wondered how to celebrate our 20th anniversary. Recognizing the new century, the Millennium Quilt was made and Capital Quilt Fest began. Named on this quilt are women who made it happen. A tear comes to my eye as I realize 9 of them are now gone. Another 7 moved away. This particular pattern now has deeper meaning to me. I still feel linked to all of you through quilting, and I am so thankful for all the wonderful memories. I offer my deepest appreciation to the charter members who organized this guild 40 years ago. Thank you.
President's Houses by Evelyn Boofink. In 2009 to 2010, members of the Capital Quilters Guild each created a quilt block based on the theme of my choice. I requested house quilt blocks. The blocks were created they created were sewn together to create this quilt I titled President's Houses. Patterns used were from wonky tonk block designs. Each member chose the design and the size of the block. It was a fun quilt to assemble. Donna Nason used machine quilting, created fun designs which helped the block stand out. Thank you, Guild members, for this beautiful gift. Machine quilting is when a quilter uses a sewing machine to stitch the layers of the quilt together. Some machines fill a room, supporting a full quilt and sewing intricate patterns.
The next 5 quilts are Quilter's first quilts. This one's called It's a Start by Sherry Wenzel. It started in 2009 when I was encouraged by 2 co-workers to take a beginning quilting class with "It will be fun." They were right. This quilt is the first time I completed the entire process, from piecing the top to quilting the sandwich. A sandwich is the term for 3 layers of a quilt: decorative top, fabric back, and the batting in between. Sherry also shares, I continued learning new quilting skills from other quilters, YouTube videos, and of course, trial and error. In this first quilt, I used stitch in the ditch quilting, which is carefully stitching in the shallow dip along each seam of the quilt top. One thing my co-workers failed to tell me is that quilting could be addictive, and I was hooked. So although I do not feel like an accomplished quilter, no YouTube video instructions from me, this quilt did give me confidence to make more. After all, it's a healthy addiction, right?
Stack and Whack Pinwheel by Patty Steinert. My love of quilting was inspired by my mother, Agnes Will, a charter member of Capital Quilters. This quilt is the first and only full-size quilt I have made. It started in the first quilting class I took, taught by Verna Fries. The pattern is an 8-piece stack and whack pinwheel, which means every block is made by cutting and rotating 8 layers of fabric, which are also used in the border. In the class, we made 8 blocks, which were to be a baby quilt. But I had so much fun seeing the unique designs developed, my 8 blocks multiplied into 20, making a quilt large enough to cover a full-size bed. Florence Harsh, also a charter member of Capital Quilters, quilted this for me with her long arm quilting machine. This quilt is lovingly on our bed in our guest room so friends and family can enjoy it with me. A long arm sewing machine fills a room with a long arm which allows it to sew across the full width of a quilt.
My very first quilt by Becky Rhodes. Well, I had only been quilting about a year, and I decided to make my new grandbaby a crib-sized quilt. I found a pattern in Better Homes and Garden Easy Quilting Projects. My granddaughter loved Finding Nemo, and I found the perfect fabric for this quilt when shopping with my friend Randa. The sales lady mentioned I could fussy cut blocks. In the car, I asked Randa, what is a fussy cut? And fussy cut is cutting carefully around details in the fabric to capture a key feature in the fabric. I fussy cut some fish for the corner post for Shayna's quilt and large blocks to allow the star character to stand out. To finish this quilt, I traced the image of a shell on freezer paper, ironed it onto a square, then hand quilted the shell pattern in the blocks, and curved lines of fish filled in the border. Shayna still uses this quilt and was quite distraught when I told her I needed it for this presentation.
Beginner's Quilt by Mary Dunn. Because my 8th grade home economics teacher soured me on quilting, I got an A in shop and a C in home economics. I swore I would never touch another sewing machine. But 13 years ago, I bought a small home embroidery machine and took some classes. I was inspired by all the beautiful quilts that I saw from other quilters and decided to take a beginning quilting class at J&R Vacuum and Sewing. Rosemary, the instructor, made the class fun and interesting. She taught us how to select basic tools and choose fabric. She taught skills such as how to cut, piece, and straighten fabric, how to add borders and backing. She taught how to stitch in the ditch and make a binding to finish the quilt. So from start to finish, I did every cut and stitch on this quilt. Since finishing this quilt, I have made over 100 more. but this is the only one I made for myself.
Civil War Chronicles by Marianne Crowe. When I turned 40, my husband asked me what I wanted for my birthday. My wedding sewing machine had just gone to sewing machine heaven, so I asked for a new one. I then started quilting. My first quilt was a graduation present for a daughter. This is my second. Okay, so it's her second. It took me 9 years to complete. It started with my husband seeing this quilt in a shop and offering to purchase a block each month so I could whip it up for him. I soon figured out it was way over my head, so I took more classes and worked on my skills for a while. In the fall of 2020, I decided to try again. My friend Kari Bees offered to help. Finally, with Kari's help, this quilt was done for Christmas 2020. Thank you, quilting friends.
These next two quilts are original designs, which means they were designed by the maker of the quilt. Flower Garden Sampler by Stephanie Olson, who is my counterpart. My husband said I have strange and wonderful relationship with dirt. Gardening is my first and favorite hobby, and it flows into my new hobby, quilting. This is my second quilt, designed using a quilting book from my mother, who sewed but didn't make quilts. The flowers, bachelor buttons, daisies, black-eyed Susans, trilliums, and poppies were drawn on heavy paper, copied with tracing paper, and sewn using paper piecing, which is where fabric is placed over the lines on paper, sewn and trimmed, and pressed to create the block. Crewel embroidery added depth and texture to each flower. Because I literally made the quilt up as I went along, extra flowers became pillows. I practiced several different sashing and border and binding techniques offered in the book to finish it off. Honestly, this quilt was made with so much trial and many errors, but I did enjoy creating my own pattern for this quilt, and I learned a lot.
Black Fantasy by Florence Harsh. This quilt was made using many, many half-square triangles. I find the challenge and diversity of designs you can make with half-square triangles fun. I also enjoy finding ways to make use of my stash. This is true to the history of quilting, when 2+ generations ago, women didn't drive to a quilt store and add to their stash. Rather, when sewing clothes for their family, they didn't waste anything. They kept scraps of fabric left over after cutting a pattern for a shirt, jacket, or dress, and used these to create beautiful, warm quilts to use as blankets for beds. And the definition of a quilter's stash is, in a quilter's stash, even small leftover scraps are saved because projects often need small pieces. Florence says, I found this pattern in a book and made this quilt all from scraps, except for the black.
Our next three quilts were created with hand-dyed fabric. This is Modern Blocks by Sister Nancy Gunderson. I wanted to use my hand-dyed fabrics, which had been waiting in a box for me for 15 years, for the right pattern to come along. It started 20 years ago in a class on dyeing fabric, where I learned to love the intense colors from Portion dyes. My heart would leap for joy at the surprise patterns on the fabrics that had been twisted, tied, and scrunched in a dye bath, but the result seemed too lovely to cut. One day, I stumbled across a pattern for a table runner. I thought it would be perfect to show off my precious dyed pieces. After all these years, I was ready to let go and finally use them. I repeated the pattern to create this full-size quilt using neutral colors to border the bright hand dyes to let them come forth in all their glory. I used a free motion machine quilting design to complement the design of the blocks. Here is the result. In free motion quilting, the quilt layers are moved in patterns while the sewing machine sews them together.
Journey by Sandy Feddick. Quilting and fabric dyeing have been for me parallel and sometimes competing journeys. This quilt is like a travel diary for me. The stars document my exploration of dyeing techniques that include batik, shibori, deconstructed screen printing, sun printing, monoprinting, screen printing, and discharge and ice and snow dyeing. Only the fabric used in the binding and backing is from commercially dyed fabric in this quilt.
Arcadia Quilt by Vicki Bame. I was inspired to make this paper piece quilt when I saw it in the Quilting for You shop in Washburn. I created it as part of a block of the month class, choosing the muted navy color tone option. So starting in 2014, I made a block each month from fabrics that had been hand dyed from the Comforts of Home quilt shop in Jamestown. Some of the blocks have more than 150 pieces. I finished assembling the blocks in 2015, but I could not figure out how to quilt it. This took me another 4 years, seeking inspiration and ideas from many different sources. I quilted one block at a time on my machine at home. Because I am not one to have a lot of UFOs, which we refer to as unfinished objects, I was glad to get her done. It now hangs over a banister at home because it is so pretty and I love the colors.
These next two quilts were hand quilted. Star of Bethlehem by Alice Hurt. I chose some of my favorite colors for this Star of Bethlehem quilt. This quilt was a challenge to assemble. Only the eyelashes were paper pieced. The pattern was 78 by 78 inches, a dimension not suitable for a bed covering. So I enlarged it by adding 2 borders on the sides, an extra border on the bottom, and fans across the top. This is one of my favorite patterns. I hand quilted this quilt in 2010 and have had it on my bed ever since. And hand quilting is when the layers are sewn together by hand, section by section, with small needle and thread.
Spencer's Birthday Quilt by Grace Thompson. This is a friendship quilt, which means each square was made special by friends or family members and then sewn together and quilted. This quilt was made for my husband's grandfather, Joseph Spencer Thompson, in Pierce, Kentucky, for his 54th birthday in September 1936. The blocks were made by his wife, Grace Thompson, who cut them out and sewed the S into the middle, recognizing her husband as he went by his middle name Spencer, not Joseph. Spencer's daughter, Janice, my mother, was 16 years old at the time of this quilt was created. She rode a mule around the hills of Kentucky, delivering blocks to family and friends, who then put a personal touch on each block with embroidery or applique with their names. After the pieces were returned, Grace sewed them together and hand quilted it before presenting it to Spencer. Before her death, my mother-in-law, Grace, wrote down information on each person who completed a block, saving the family story for generations.
Moonglow by Rita Fuller. This quilt is pieced entirely by hand, meaning it was sewn with needle and thread, not using a machine, including all the borders. I decided I wanted to make one hand-piece quilt for each of our 4 children. This is my 3rd. I can't claim credit for the color selection in this quilt because I used the color coordinating group the pattern's author, Jenny Beyer, used in her original design. Her vibrant colors and bold contrasts have always attracted me to her works. I have not given the hand-piece quilt to the kids as of yet, but they have seen them. They have often seen me working on them, so they appreciate the labor of love that has gone into creating them. I have discreetly asked them of their preference among the hand-piece quilts. Unfortunately, 2 of our 4 children have selected this quilt, Moonglow, as their #1 choice. And of course, it's no longer discreet, right?
The next 6 quilts focus on the applique technique, where pieces of fabric are carefully cut to a specific shape to capture a design and then applied to the background fabric with careful hand or machine stitching around the edges to prevent fraying. This is Winter Times by Donna Nason. I love snowmen and winter themes. When I saw this kit for the quilt, I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist buying it at a booth at the Indian Summer Quilt Show in West Fargo. The finished quilt is different from the original pattern, as the staff at the quilt shop helped redesign the blocks to fit the snowman theme I wanted. The border fabric really makes it a fun quilt. I have won a number of ribbons for this quilt at various quilt shows in North Dakota. I display this quilt in my home over the Christmas season, sometimes hanging it over the banister or thrown over a chair. I always encourage my grandchildren to play with and cuddle with my quilts. If they wear one out, well, I'll just make another one. My friend Tammy did an amazing job custom quilting this for me. She is a true artist.
Roses and Triangles by Florence Harsh. This quilt is another of my own patterns I created. I designed it because I could not find a pattern that would create the finished look I wanted. It is all made from scraps, which I used to create each block. I then sewed the blocks into a star pattern, placing the larger blocks with roses at angles around the star and at the corners. The roses are appliqued to the larger blocks to create a lovely rose garden for my bed. I also made matching pillow shams, and it makes a beautiful bright cover for my bed.
For the Birds by Sister Nancy Gunderson. This quilt celebrates two of my loves, music and the many different birds that return each year. I used a template to cut the birds out of interesting fabrics. I perched them on this musical fabric to create a whimsical scene. I wanted this fun, happy quilt to connect music with birdsong. To my disappointment, when I had a musician play the notes on the fabric, we found no discernible tune. But I am sure the birds don't mind. The birds are raw edge appliqued. Raw edge applique does not protect the edge of the sewn piece, allowing a more natural, casual look, in this case, feathers for my birds. Quilting was done with a long arm sewing machine with a free-flowing pattern to reflect the bird habitat. The leaf print in the border is quilted with variegated leaves. I enjoyed just looking at this quilt and imagining the birds visiting with each other and singing the tunes given to them.
Wagon Wheels by Martha Downs. Sue Daly, of Patchwork with Busy Fingers, is an Australian quilt designer that I have admired for years. Her innovative construction techniques of English paper piecing and beautiful needle-turned applique are amazing. Wagon Wheels is a gorgeous quilt I created using both techniques. This is my first quilt constructed using needle-turned applique, reverse applique, and English paper piecing with elongated hexagons and squares. It took me 2 years to make this quilt. I mostly worked on Wagon Wheels when on vacations and at quilt retreats. All the fabric used to create this quilt was pulled from my stash at home. So as you can guess, the stashes for quilters get pretty large.
My husband doesn't know.
Oh, sorry.
Connie's Garden by Pam Fenoff. My mother Connie and I had a strained relationship for over 40 years, but she gave me some good gifts. The best two, an introduction to Jesus and a love of gardening. The story of this quilt begins when I took a quilting class, mostly applique, as an educational challenge, and it was challenging. There were times when I wanted to quit, but I knew that I would love the final product, and I was learning a lot. The garden features of this quilt and the constant stress of making it made me think of my mother. So it seemed appropriate to give it to her when I was done, and I knew that she would love it. She's a crafter, and I knew that she would appreciate the time I spent. She had it from 2017 until she passed away last September. It was the only thing that I requested from my stepfather. And like this quilt, the yo-yos, the circular flowers are made with a yo-yo technique.
Louise's Quilt by Louise Lindemann. One memory. I was 3 or 4 years old. She was 90. She was regal in her black dress and jewelry. I sat on my mother's lap. This is how I remember my grandmother, Louise. I remember her deep voice and robust laugh. A German immigrant, Louise did well, accumulating 4,400 acres of farmland, a landmark store, and a stately home in Enderlin, North Dakota. About 20 years later, with my husband and young son, we made a Christmas visit to my elderly, childless great-uncle and aunt in my old hometown. Aunt Mary brought out this quilt. She unfolded it, sharing that Louise had made it. She then gave it to me. Though young, I realized the importance of this heirloom gift. Extremely grateful, I have preserved it over these 50 years. Simply made, the cream body is a coarser fabric. It was hand-sewn with black stitching, herringbone style between the sections, and blanket stitch around the tulips. Pink yarn hand ties it every 12 to 14 inches. And hand tying stabilizes a quilt by sewing and tying loops of heavy thread or yarn through all the layers at intervals.
Words to Live By, made by Marlene Sapa. I chose to include this quilt in the presentation because of the message it conveys. Today, as I submit it, I would like to focus not on the quilting, but on how it speaks to me. The words to live by are relevant, but really speak to me currently. They are joy, love, kindness, hospitality, family, loyalty, courage, trust, passion, charity, honor, and hope. While I hope you enjoy this quilt's beauty, I really want you to be reminded of the words as you move forward in your lives. This is a wool applique on cotton, a summer block of the week project. The stitching is too detailed to finish any one block in a week, and it took me 2 years to complete. If you have not tried working with wool, I would definitely recommend it.
Journey of a Quilter by Edie Shear. I finished this quilt in 2014. I am sharing it because of the message it carries, with the focus on the center message. Quote, I have stitched, formed friendships, laughed, shared secrets, eased burdens, learned lessons. For this I can be grateful. This is the journey of a quilter, unquote. This quilt is a block of the month quilt. The block of the month is when each person makes a quilt section or block each month, sharing new techniques and skills. I used my own hand-dyed fabrics and scraps from my scrap basket to finish this quilt. I enjoy the embroidered messages and designs.
Victorian Roses by Julie Shoemaker. I made this quilt for my mom. The designs were created using machine embroidery. My mom had it displayed on her piano and loved it. She passed away in October 2016 after a tragic car accident. When I look at this quilt, I think of my loving mother. Our next 10 quilts were created using traditional patterns.
Camille Curves by Gunnel Torgerson. This colorful batik fabric quilt was made entirely in our hitchhiker RV while we were wintering in Texas, where an old Victorian house was turned into, or had been turned into, a beautiful fabric store. I was in the store moaning that I had missed the class they offered on making this quilt, but the store owner thought I could handle the pattern and the sewing demands needed to make this quilt without the class. She gave me the pattern, some tips, sold me the fabric, and sent me home to do it. Back in the RV, I cut and sorted pieces for each block. The technique resulted in no scraps from the batik fat quarters. I used a flannel-covered tri-fold design board propped up against the sofa to decide how to position the blocks and the pattern. While sitting on the floor, I arranged one small section at a time. My sewing machine was set up on our tiny dining room table, and in that small space, I completed this entire queen-sized quilt.
It's Another Mystery by Michelle Ripplinger. This is one of my mystery quilts, and it's done. What is a mystery quilt? Well, it's a mystery for the quilter. To create each one, the quilter is given a list of supplies, some instructions, and the finished size. The final look of the quilt is gradually revealed during the class. Due to COVID, the 2020 Badlands Quilters Retreat was done as a virtual class, a weekend together, yet safely at home. For this class, we needed 6 coordinating fabrics, a background fabric, a zinger fabric, and 2 border fabrics. I used colors from the border fabric to guide my choice for the rest of the colors for this quilt. Instructor Kathy gave preparation homework. As is my custom, my homework was not done before class. This means I was always running behind, but I got it done. I have made several mystery quilts and am never disappointed with the patterns and the designs we create. Though many are still UFOs, I have strong intentions to get them all done, maybe in a future class.
Green Tumblers by Sandra Solberg. After noticing I had a surplus of aging green fabrics, I decided to cut them into tumblers, which are trapezoid-shaped pieces. This was first constructed as a queen-size quilt with matching columns of tumblers, but I did not like it very much. So I took it apart, mixed them up, and made this quilt. My favorite part of this quilt is the quilting itself. I tried different quilting patterns, placed graffiti style, with a goal of getting completion, not perfection. My second favorite part was adding more tumblers and green print stripes on the back. This allowed me to make the back fabric big enough to finish the quilt while using what I had on hand. I think one of the gifts and skills of quilting is learning not to waste anything.
Brown Falling Charms by Sandra Solberg. I decided to use this quilt pattern because I had a jelly roll of fabric to use up and I needed to make a 40 by 60 inch quilt. A jelly roll is a collection of narrow strips of different colors rolled in a random manner. To make this quilt, I modified a Missouri Star Quilt Company pattern by changing the size of the pieces from 5-inch to 3.5-inch squares, allowing me to create 5-inch blocks. I liked the pattern so much that I started cutting more of my scraps into 3.5-inch squares, added 2.5-inch neutral strips. The largest color group was brown, the reason for the name of this quilt. With my leftover squares of red, blue, green, orange, pink, purple, and yellow, perhaps there will be a sequel.
Jungle Fever by Marilyn Orgard. This was a fun, easy quilt pattern to make. It was created out of stacks of 10-inch squares quilters call layer cakes, because the blocks of fabric are stacked like the layers of a cake, then cut into squares and rectangles. These are sewn together to make the blocks, which are then assembled into the quilt top. The pattern for the blocks making up this quilt is called quarter log cabin, with progressively longer rectangular strips of fabric wrapping around a square piece, overlapping at the ends like Lincoln logs. The colors, shading, and different prints in the fabric of this quilt give it visual variety, which is why I like it and chose to share it.
Lone Star by Arlene Olson. I always wanted a Lone Star quilt, so when I saw this pattern in a paper piecing kit, I decided to take on the challenge. Actually, the paper piecing made it fairly easy to put together, and I use it on my bed all the time. I have also made memories for my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren by making quilts for each of them. I'm currently sewing one for more recent addition to our family, a great-granddaughter in Fargo. I have been told my 2 great-granddaughters in New Jersey love snuggling under the quilts and afghans I have made for them when they go to bed at night. My daughter and daughter-in-law have also learned to quilt and are also members of Capital Quilters.
This is a hand piece quilt, Moonglow by Darlene Bender. This is one of my favorite quilts. It took a year to make this quilt, paper piecing by hand to create each square block. Each month I collected the fabric to sew at home. Each medallion is named after a lunar sea, Sea of Clouds, Sea of Serenity, Sea of Tranquility, etc. While most of the quilt is made of my favorite colors, the khaki brown surprised me. I did not expect the interest it adds to this quilt, making all the colors pop. This helped me stretch my color palette. With the aid of Bertha Abel's quilting, it was finished in 2011. This quilt is on my bed during the winter months.
T-shirt quilt. Old t-shirt quilt designs are made into memory quilts. This is Meet Kenny Bates by Audrey Erickson. You could meet Kenny Bates 2 ways. One would cost you money, the other shoe leather. Often when I introduced myself, many said, "I think I know your dad." I would ask with some trepidation, did it cost you money? If it did, it was probably because they got a traffic ticket from my dad during his 30 years as a North Dakota highway patrolman. If not, they met at one of the hundreds of charity races he ran in 3 states, giving hope to others by raising money for support and research. So happily, there was often a good story to share. He wore his favorite tees to tatters, but others piled up in 55-gallon totes and inspired this t-shirt memory quilt made by a local home economics teacher. 30 years later, the screen printing is flaking off, the chocolate stain is permanent, but it gives me a warm hug from my dad, and my mother, a skilled seamstress but not a quilter, shakes her head that I am a quilter now.
Dresden Plate by Gwen Zing. Our quilt group from Carson went to our first quilting retreat, the Frozen Fabric Frolic, at the Camp of the Cross near Garrison, North Dakota, not knowing what to expect. The snow was deep that year, and it was cold, but we were excited to be off on an adventure. After this retreat, I was in love with quilting. I signed up for the Dresden Plate class. Not knowing what colors I would want, I brought a suitcase of fabric. And I got teased for that, but a gal's gotta be ready. My suitcase of options gave me the opportunity to make this scrappy quilt. Scrappy means using assorted scraps of fabric when creating a quilt pattern. After a year of work, my quilt was finally on my bed. When we bought a larger California-sized king bed, I added extra drop-down panels on the sides to be able to keep using it.
This next quilt is made of rows of classic traditional patterns. It's called Fairy Row by Edie Shear. This quilt was a 2009 exchange project in our Hen House Quilters group of friends who gather to quilt. We defined some rules and a theme of the month for each row. Each started with our own row, then boxed it with fabric and any personal preferences like no purple for our friends to follow. At our monthly meetings, the box with each person's new row was secretly passed on to the other members of the group. We had our big reveal at their Christmas party when each got their container with the rows created by others as a gift to each other. I put my rows together, adding spacing blocks and some fairy applique, dimensional elements, and then tying the patterns together. I machine quilted it on my HQ16.
The last 7 quilts in our program are called Modern, using newer quilting techniques and patterns. This is called Urban Meets Modern by Stephanie Mart. This quilt is one of my favorite quilts so far. I am a modern quilter and I love seeing curves in the patterns of quilts. This is one of my first quilts to have curves in it. On this quilt, lining up each of the seams correctly definitely took some time. Seams were sewn, ripped, and re-sewn, but the final pattern was worth it. I created it using our wedding colors to complement the abstract fabric patterns, and I used ghost blocks in the quilting to extend the pattern. I was honored to win the Viewer's Choice Award with this quilt at the 2018 Quilt Fest. And you can see the detail that you can get with machine quilting on these quilts.
This is Potluck Revival by Michelle Doyle. This is my COVID quilt. Finished because staying at home safe in my bubble gave me uninterrupted time in my sewing room. What a gift. It started as a small quilt top at National Quilting Day class right here at the Heritage Center more than 10 years ago. But when I dug out this unfinished project in 2019, I no longer liked it. So I unsewed it and started again. In self-imposed isolation, I had 2 rules for remaking this quilt. Use only fabric I had in my stash and make it bright and cheery. In 10+ years, my fabric stash has grown exponentially, so rule 1 was no problem. I finished it with a scrappy black and white checked border, randomly interrupted with small colored squares from the main quilt blocks. The border design helps the eye move around this very busy quilt. Thank you to my wonderful Capital Quilter sisterhood for your support and friendship. You have taught me many skills and techniques. The most valuable quilting principle I have learned is finished is perfect.
20 Bright Colors by Sandy L. Bates. The directions started with pick 20 bright colors. That was all it took. I was in. I love all the movement and optical illusions of this quilt. I wanted to make sure I covered the color spectrum. My attention in high school chemistry and physics paid off as Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet of the prismatic color wheel drove my fabric selection. The pattern of quilting, I believe, makes this quilt extraordinary. Look, a star, a pinwheel, a big circle march in a Mardi Gras parade across the top of this quilt, which changes when viewed from different angles, keeping it interesting. As a newer quilter, the skills of pressing the blocks and matching the points needed to create these blocks was challenging. But this quilt still brightens my life with 20 bright colors when skies are gray.
Ombre Star by Diane Stange. I made this quilt for my husband as he likes geometric quilts. I found the pattern online at the Calico Hutch quilt shop in Hayward, Minnesota. It is made with a 10-degree triangle ruler and just 2 fabrics, black and ombre, which it has one color at the edges and shades to a second color at the fold. Strips of ombre fabric accent the top and bottom of this quilt. There are 36 points converging at the center. It is made by first sewing the quadrants, then putting the quadrants together to complete the pattern. This is definitely one of the most challenging quilts I have ever made.
Laura's Graduation by Bobby Hagan. Grandma, that's the one I want, exclaimed my granddaughter, Lauren, when she saw this quilt. Well, not exactly this quilt, but one almost exactly like it that belonged to my other granddaughter. And another one that belongs to my oldest granddaughter. Same pattern, different polka dots, different colors. This is my 3rd graduation quilt using this pattern. Obviously, it is very popular with my granddaughters. They pick the pattern, I pick the fabric. But we all love polka dots, so that's a given. I keep the colors bright and cheery, just like my girls. The pattern for graduation quilt number 4 has already been selected by my 8-year-old granddaughter. And guess what? Same pattern, keep the polka dots. She'll think about the colors.
This is Trick or Treat by Rosemary Hertz. I wanted to make a Halloween quilt to remind me of the fun times my 2 sisters and I had when we went trick-or-treating. We grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, so we stopped at many, many houses. We always had a blast and ran as fast as we could to get to as many houses as possible. We also ended up with enough candy to last a lifetime. Our pillowcases were half full, and our tummies even more so, full of sweets. Lots of memories were made. I still love Halloween to this day and enjoy seeing the kids dressed up in their costumes, having fun like I did when I was young. This quilt was made using a jelly roll of fabric with black square spacers to add interest.
Trellis by Ashley Delabar. I had to choose a quilt to display, and when I was going through a closet at home, I found this one packed away. When I took it out, I realized I'd forgotten how much I loved it. I had really enjoyed the process of making the 100 individual and unique blocks and putting them together in this fun way. While orange is not a color I often consider using in a quilt, it really works in this pattern. I think that's why I liked this quilt more, because it is so different from the other quilts I have made. I love how the quilting added a secondary design element to this quilt. I am happy to share it as a part of our Quilters Guild bed turning program. We have 2 more quilts to share with you that could not be brought in here because they are part of the, what is it called, Jenny, here? Part of the collection here at the Heritage Center. But we have pictures of them and a story to share.
In 1986, Then First Lady Jane Sinner initiated a governor's residence quilt project. Quilters were asked to submit an idea, and Mrs. Sinner and a committee chose this design, Waving Wheat, which was designed by Carol Kelly. In 1988, Quilt Guild in Grand Forks and Fargo completed the blocks and the top. The top was then sent to Capital Quilters to be finished. A quilt frame was set up in the governor's residence, and the member spent several afternoons doing the quilting. After it was finished, Mrs. Sinner hosted all the participants to a luncheon at the residence.
This is the Millennium Quilt, and there's also a Millennium Quilt 2. The quilt blocks to make this quilt were made and donated by each quilt guild in North Dakota that was in existence in 1999 to 2000. The blocks were assembled, and it was hand-quilted and bound by members of the guild. 4 blocks came in late, and they were assembled into a second, smaller quilt. Capital Quilt member Debbie Forsberg spearheaded this project. Thank you for attending this Sensational Sunday presentation celebrating the 40th anniversary of the North Dakota Capital Quilters Guild. And thank you to the State Historical Society of North Dakota for supporting us in our work in this event. Their staff has been amazingly helpful, and thank you, Jenny, who works here and is also a guild member, for really helping us through this. You were great. Thank you, everybody.